The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was thick with anticipation, a weight pressing down on everyone present. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, some leaning forward in their seats, others whispering in hushed voices. The wooden benches creaked under shifting bodies as the audience adjusted, trying to get a better look at the young man standing in the center of it all. Jordan Carter, just 19 years old, stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his posture straight but not rigid. His dark eyes scanned the room, not with defiance, but with something quieter, calculated observation. He could feel the scrutiny pressing in on him from all sides. The bailiff stood stone-faced near the judge's bench. The stenographer's fingers rested lightly on the keys, poised to capture every word. Even the prosecutor, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, was watching him with an expression that wavered between amusement and mild curiosity. But the person who mattered most was Judge Malcolm Reeves. The seasoned judge sat at his high bench, the weight of authority draped over him like an invisible cloak. He had the relaxed posture of a man who had seen it all before, because he had. With his glasses resting low on his nose and fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the polished wood of his desk, he exuded the kind of weary amusement that came with years of dealing with young defendants who thought they were smarter than they were. His lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer as he eyed Jordan. Then, in a voice laced with dry amusement, he spoke. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" Reeves tilted his head slightly, studying the young man before him. "This isn't a high school debate club, kid." A ripple of laughter broke the courtroom's tense silence. It was the kind of laugh that wasn't meant to be cruel but held the weight of expectation. Expectation that Jordan, like so many before him, would shrink under the pressure. The bailiff allowed himself the faintest smirk. The stenographer exhaled sharply through her nose, fingers tapping a few idle keys before stopping again. Even the prosecutor chuckled under his breath, already predicting the inevitable outcome of this hearing. But Jordan didn't flinch. He didn't laugh. He didn't shift uncomfortably. He simply stood there, letting the moment hang in the air, unbroken. Because this moment wasn't an accident. It was years in the making. While other kids memorized football stats, Jordan had been memorizing legal precedents. While his friends spent weekends playing video games, he sat on the couch next to his mother, Elaine Carter, as she pored over case files late into the night. Elaine had been a paralegal for over 20 years, and though she never pushed her son toward the law, it was impossible for him not to absorb it. He learned through osmosis, listening to her vent about cases where defense attorneys barely put up a fight, where judges played favorites, where prosecutors bent the rules just enough to get away with it. He learned that the law wasn't just about right and wrong, it was about who could argue their case best. By the time he was 14, he could deconstruct a court case better than most law students. He knew which arguments worked, which ones flopped, and most importantly, where people made mistakes. And Judge Reeves had just made one. But no one else seemed to notice. Reeves sighed, flipping open the case file with a deliberate slowness. "Let's make this quick. I have a golf game at 2. Laughter rippled through the room again, but this time something shifted. The amusement in the crowd wasn't just at Jordan's expense. It was a performance, a carefully constructed power play designed to establish control. The judge was making it clear. Jordan wasn't in charge here. At least that's what Reeves thought. Jordan's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. He tilted his head just slightly, as if processing the judge's words with quiet amusement. The smirk vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. But for anyone paying attention, it was a signal that Jordan saw the cracks. The courtroom wasn't just a place where justice was served, it was a stage, and Jordan had spent enough time studying the performances to recognize when someone got sloppy. The way Reeves leaned back in his chair, the way he spoke with that casual arrogance, it told Jordan everything he needed to know. The judge had already made up his mind. This wasn't a real hearing. It was a formality, a rubber stamp before moving on to more important things. That was his first mistake, because if there was one thing Jordan had learned from years of watching his mother dissect cases, it was that the smallest oversight could unravel everything. Jordan's fingers twitched at his sides, an almost imperceptible movement. He glanced briefly at the prosecutor, who was now flipping through his own notes, clearly not expecting much resistance. The man's entire demeanor screamed complacency. That was his second mistake. Jordan took a slow breath, letting the tension in the room settle before he spoke. "Your Honor," he said, his voice even, controlled. "Before we begin, I'd like to clarify something for the record." Reeves raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening. "Oh? And what's that?" Jordan's eyes locked onto the judge's. "Would you say your impartiality is critical to ensuring a fair proceeding?" A flicker of something crossed Reeves's face. It was gone in an instant, but Jordan caught it. The smirk, the offhand golf comment, the way the courtroom had already decided the outcome before the hearing even began. He wasn't just another kid in trouble. He was watching, learning, and now he was playing the game. The judge shifted slightly, clearing his throat. "Of course," he said, his tone still light but now carrying the slightest edge of caution. "Why do you ask?" Jordan let a beat pass. Not too long, just enough to let the silence stretch, to make people wonder. Then he spoke. "Because I'd like to formally motion for your recusal." Silence. The room, so full of amusement just moments ago, suddenly felt frozen in time. The laughter was gone. The whispers died. Even the prosecutor, who had been absently shuffling papers, stopped mid-motion. For the first time since the hearing began, the balance shifted, and Jordan knew it. The courtroom felt heavier now, like the very air had thickened with the weight of expectation. Every creak of a wooden bench, every hushed whisper from the gallery seemed to stretch the moment out. At the prosecution's table, Mitchell Carrington adjusted his cuffs with the deliberate ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. He had the look of someone who already knew the final score, like a chess player who had checkmated his opponent 5 moves ago. His suit was sharp, dark navy, with just the right amount of authority. His tie, a deep burgundy, was knotted with surgical precision. Even his posture radiated control. When he stood, it wasn't just rising from his seat, it was a performance. "Your Honor," Carrington began, his voice smooth, practiced, effortless, "the state will prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the defendant, Jordan Carter, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle. A 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest." A few heads in the gallery turned toward Jordan, eyes narrowing. Carrington stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor as he approached the jury. Every movement was intentional, every pause expertly placed. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself. The murmurs in the gallery swelled. Guilty. That's what the evidence said. That's what the prosecution wanted everyone to believe. Judge Reeves barely looked up from his bench. His expression was unreadable, but the way he tapped his fingers against the wood suggested impatience. "Go on." Carrington gave a satisfied nod, flipping through his notes with an air of rehearsed ease. He didn't need them. This was muscle memory. The defense may argue that this was a misunderstanding, that Mr. Carter is just an unfortunate victim of circumstance. He glanced toward the defense table, the smirk on his face growing. "But let's be honest." He turned then, locking eyes with Jordan for the first time. "What kind of victim runs from the police?" Silence. The question wasn't just rhetorical. It was a dagger, meant to slice through any sympathy before it could take root. Jordan didn't blink. He didn't shift in his seat. He didn't give Carrington the reaction he was looking for. But the tension in the room thickened like storm clouds gathering over a battlefield. Carrington let the silence drag out just long enough to make it uncomfortable. Then, with a final glance at the jury, he continued. "We also have testimony from Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The arrest was by the book." Judge Reeves exhaled sharply through his nose, his fingers still tapping. He finally glanced up, eyes flicking to Jordan, before settling back on Carrington. "Sounds straightforward to me. And to most people in the room, it probably did. A stolen car, a chase, a suspect fleeing. What else was there to consider?" Jordan's heart pounded, but his face remained impassive. He had seen this play out too many times, watched trials where defendants didn't even realize they had lost before the first witness was called. But he wasn't like them. He saw the cracks, the gaps in the story, and most importantly, he saw Carrington's overconfidence. Still, he stayed silent, watching, waiting. Judge Reeves sighed, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. "All right, let's hear the defense." Lisa Thornton, Jordan's public defender, hesitated before standing. It was subtle, but Jordan caught it. The slight delay, the way her fingers curled against the edge of the table before she pushed herself up. She had barely spoken since stepping into the courtroom. And that wasn't because she was some brilliant strategist waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was because she didn't believe they had a chance. "Your Honor, my client—" Jordan placed a hand on her arm. She froze, glancing at him. A silent request. A moment of hesitation. Then slowly, she sat back down. The gallery stirred. A few exchanged glances, eyebrows raised. The bailiff shifted his weight slightly, suddenly more attentive. Judge Reeves lifted an eyebrow. "What's this now?" Jordan stood. His movements were deliberate, not too fast, not too slow. He straightened his shoulders, took in the room, and met the judge's gaze without hesitation. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went still. For a second, it was as if no one had fully processed what he had just said. Then the reactions came. A low murmur from the gallery. A quick rustle of papers from the prosecution's table. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Judge Reeves stared at him, amused. "You'll what?" Jordan didn't falter. His voice was steady, measured. "I'll be defending myself." A pause. A beat too long. Then, Carrington let out a short, sharp laugh. "This should be interesting." It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said it. The way he didn't even try to hide the condescension in his tone. The way he looked at Jordan, not as an opponent, but as entertainment. The tension shifted again, subtle but real. Jordan caught it in the way Judge Reeves leaned back just slightly, eyes narrowing as if reconsidering him. In the way a few jurors straightened in their seats, now paying just a little more attention, because something was different now. Something had changed, and for the first time since the trial started, Jordan wasn't the one on the defensive. He took his first step forward, and just like that, everything was about to change. Jordan let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. The weight of 1,000 eyes pressed against him, waiting, judging. He could hear the restless shifting in the gallery, the scribbling of a reporter's pen, the deep inhale of someone holding their breath. Then finally he spoke. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington smirked, arms crossed, a picture of forced patience. "Go ahead." Jordan took his time. He let his gaze sweep across the jury before settling back on the prosecutor. "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Carrington exhaled sharply, his irritation barely masked. "That's right." "And that testimony is in his report?" Carrington nodded. "Of course." Jordan held that answer for a moment, turning it over in his mind like a chess piece, considering his next move. Then he turned to Judge Reeves, squaring his shoulders. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." A murmur rippled through the courtroom like the first tremors of an earthquake. Even the court stenographer paused for a fraction of a second before resuming her furious typing. Judge Reeves, ever the no-nonsense type, peered at Jordan over his glasses. "On what grounds?" Jordan pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time. A calculated move. "Show them you have nothing to hide. Show them you're in control." "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." The room froze. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the very walls were leaning in to hear what would happen next. Carrington's smirk faltered. "What are you talking about?" Jordan stepped forward. He wasn't the one on trial anymore. He was the one holding the gavel now. "If the court allows me, I'd like to request Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If he was where he claimed to be, the records will prove it, but—" He let the word hang in the air, allowing the suspense to do its work. "I have a feeling it won't." The gallery erupted, a mixture of gasps, hushed whispers, and even a stifled "no way" from the back row. The bailiff took a step forward, ready to restore order, but Judge Reeves held up a hand. He was interested now. His gaze flicked to Carrington, who suddenly looked less like the king of the courtroom and more like a man grasping for a lifeline. The prosecutor cleared his throat, buying himself a second or two of time. But a second wasn't enough. The jury had noticed. The gallery had noticed. And most importantly, Judge Reeves had noticed. Carrington shuffled his papers, a nervous tell Jordan had clocked an hour ago. Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains, the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. Jordan nodded. That's true. A flicker of relief crossed Carrington's face. Then Jordan took another step forward. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. He turned back to the jury, letting his voice drop just enough to make them lean in. Fingerprints tell you that I touched the steering wheel. They don't tell you when. He walked to the evidence table, where the prosecution had neatly laid out their case. He gestured toward a photo of the car, a close-up of the wheel. No smudges, no streaks, just clear, intact prints. He looked up, locking eyes with one of the jurors. That means whoever drove the car last did so with a perfect grip. No sweat, no movement, like they just placed their hands there and left them. The woman in the front row frowned, processing what he was implying. Jordan continued, his voice steady. You ever driven in a high-speed chase? Your hands don't stay still. They grip, they slide, they move. If I'd been driving during that chase, the prints would have been smeared, but they weren't. More whispers. Jordan turned back to Carrington. So, here's the question. If I wasn't behind the wheel during the chase, how did my fingerprints get there? Carrington opened his mouth, closed it. Jordan pressed on. Maybe I touched that wheel earlier in the day. Maybe someone placed my hands there after the fact. Or maybe... He let the sentence dangle, forcing the jury to finish the thought themselves. Because people believe what they conclude on their own. Judge Reeves sighed, rubbing his temple. Mr. Carrington, any response? Carrington hesitated, then shook his head. Jordan's heart pounded, but he kept his expression unreadable. Judge Reeves exhaled through his nose. Without solid testimony, and with this reasonable doubt surrounding the fingerprint evidence, I have no choice but to dismiss the case. The gavel came down. Case dismissed. Jordan walked out of that courtroom a free man. The sun felt different on his skin now, lighter. But this wasn't just about him. This was about all the people who didn't have the knowledge to fight back, who didn't have the words to expose the cracks in the system. Because the justice system isn't just built on laws. It's run by people. And people can be wrong. People can be corrupt. People can be changed. But only if we make them. So if this story made you think, even for a second, share it. Because next time, it might not be Jordan. It might be someone you know.